Back to our topic then, and we've been discussing what's been going on in the UK over the past few days. Furious riots in English cities and politicians struggling to come up with a response or an explanation as to why it happened. Vivienne Walt, you were just about to tell us what your take on this week's events was.
Well, I mean, I like, you know, my other wise panelists here can't make head or tail of really why this happened, although what seems so peculiar is the sort of viral nature of it. But what is striking to me is the way Cameron came out looking. And very much like the phone hacking scandal a little earlier this summer, he always looks like he is doing just fine. He never really breaks a sweat. And I think that's a real problem for him.
He used to always talk about rolling his sleeves up and getting down to business.
We're talking about an old Etonian, you know, silver spoon in the mouth kind of a guy. And I think to begin with, for a lot of Brits, very much like what Chris says, this kind of sticks in the craw a little bit. He looks just too privileged, too much like a tiny, tiny minority in Britain. And here he comes out, he's on holiday in a villa in Tuscany, he gets back late.
Waits 3 days. Yeah.
He waits 3 days and then still doesn't look like he's in panic mode. So I think he's got a real problem. I think he's having a particularly bad summer and he hasn't handled it very well.
But he's also responding, isn't he, Christopher, to a lot of anger among people in Britain who weren't involved in these riots, because there has been a furious response. I mean, there was a poll and some 77% of people said they wanted electronic tasers, they wanted water cannon, they wanted the army on the streets. You know, people wanted a much more heavy-handed response.
Sure, people don't support these riots. This is not a popular movement. I think it's a general consensus, whether it's true or not, that these are basically thugs out on the streets, young and old. People exploiting a chaotic situation to just profit from it. Grab a TV, grab a flat screen, grab I don't know, whatever they grab these days.
Trainers, a lot of sneakers were being taken.
Yeah, a lot of sneakers, exactly. A lot of expensive tennis shoes. So whatever they're doing, I don't think there's much support for it. But I think Vivienne's right about Cameron. It may sound odd to say that it's a problem for him that he's not breaking a sweat, but he's a spin doctor, basically. And there's the impression...
He's an ex-PR man, isn't he?
Yeah, he's an ex-PR man. And the impression is that he not only is riding above all this, but he's not even particularly aware of it, that it's not what's happening, it's the message that he can construct. So he's constructing a message of, we're getting tough, we're on top of this, after he didn't come back for 3 days while the country was burning. So I think it's not a good situation for him.
And we had a discussion in Parliament yesterday about this, and some of the proposals put forward were, taking away these people's homes, taking away their welfare payments, putting people in jail for years and years. You know, do you think there's a knee-jerk response by the government?
Well, there's always a knee-jerk response to anything. This is politics. We see it in the markets, we see it in parliaments. But what struck me was the shrillness of the right-wing rhetoric. I mean, it's all about punishment. There's no effort at having any note. I didn't hear a word of compassion, not even for the kid who got shot. And I think that rings badly. I think it simply accentuates the gap between a right-wing government, which is covered by the Liberals, and a society that knows it's in for austerity, that knows cuts are coming. And we've already seen protests against the cuts. Now, I'm not saying that's what this was about, but one does have more of a feeling of class war now in Britain than I've felt in 10 years, put it that way.
Quite, and it's certainly a country that, if you look at the figures, is more unequal than ever. The richest 10% now more than 200 times richer than the poorest people. So do you think this is a contributor?
Well, like I said, it's very hard to really judge what really happened here. And if these people are not very happy with their social situation, which I can imagine considering the current circumstances, then they just have to look at Spain, because that's a way how you can also express your anger, but in a very peaceful way and a very civilized manner. So I really don't understand what's going on in Britain. And it's of course clear that there's a lot of inequality, but that has always been the case in the UK, so that's nothing new.
You know, I think there's one positive point to be made about these riots, whether in Britain or in France earlier, and that's how few people are actually killed in these riots. If you're an American and you think back on the history of riots in America, it's a horrifying prospect.
Like in California.
California in 92, the riots in Los Angeles, more than 50 people were killed. That doesn't count the number injured. I mean, the level of violence in America is just mind-boggling when this
Well, you
kind of
don't
thing
have the
happens.
level of gun ownership in
Absolutely. Absolutely.
anywhere in Europe, really.
So before we get too superior about Britain,
Yeah.
I think we Americans need to take that into account.
What are your thoughts about moves by the media to put pictures of people caught on CCTV in the newspapers?
Well, this is a fascinating debate anyway. I mean, first with the police.
And the
because,
police, of course, published
you know,
these photos themselves.
But the first debate was, were the police being passive and just relying on all the closed-circuit cameras to do their work for them? And I think that's a very interesting question. I mean, they weren't confronting people. They were making them look up to get their pictures taken to find them later. I find it difficult. I mean, you know, these are people who presumably are innocent until they go to court, and their faces are there. Now, you know, if someone's in the middle of breaking something, fine. But it does bother me. It's one thing for the police to put out photos saying, we want these people. It's another thing for the press, I think, to just kind of, and you know what the British press is like. I mean, they will call people scum and blah, blah, blah.
Catch a moron was the
Yes,
Sun's
exactly.
headline yesterday.
When they haven't been caught, first of all, let alone tried or charged.
It's
And
sort
this
of the
bothers
perp
me.
walk in your own neighborhood. You can do the perp walk and never leave your quarter.
Another controversial move in terms of liberal freedoms was the crackdown on BlackBerry Messenger, because this is, of course, the technology that a lot of the writers were using. And our digital media editor this week was telling me how the British government is reacting quite in the way China does when things like this happen.
China or the United Arab Emirates
Yeah.
or Saudi Arabia or lots of other places. They don't like BlackBerry Messenger. It's too hard to monitor.
It was great in Tahrir Square, but in London?
Yeah.
Whoa,
Right.
that's a terrible
Right.
No,
thing.
thank you, please. We're British.
Right. No Blackberries, please, we're British. Quite.
It's called Kill the Messenger, right?
As it were. Yes.
And all of this makes David Cameron's, when he was in opposition, he said he'd like to hug a hoodie. Now that all seems quite, I don't know if you remember that. It seems quite far away now anyway.
Thank God I'd forgotten that.
All right, let's move on to our last topic of the evening. We're ending in Syria, where the bloodshed that's become all too common over the past few months continued this week. Hundreds of people died as the Syrian army continued its policy of invading trouble spots like Hama. One thing, though, did change this week. Arab regimes, including Saudi Arabia, condemned President Bashar al-Assad over the deaths of so many Sunni Muslims. The kingdom called Damascus a killing machine. Bahrain and Kuwait also withdrew their ambassadors from the country, while Turkey stepped up the pressure on its neighbour, issuing what it called a final warning. Now, all of this still falling on deaf ears, those ears being
Well, I think
President
what's
Assad's.
really worrying, especially to Western leaders, is you had this kind of euphoria over the beginning of the Arab Spring, which is turning out to be a very brutal kind of crackdown on, you know, the follow-up revolutions, if you like. And in a way, sort of nothing will really help. If Assad is prepared to continue brutal repressiveness. He's got most of the military behind him, although there seems to be some fissures there. He can continue doing this with many more hundreds killed. He's killed, his father killed thousands, and we're only up to about 1,500 dead so far in the 4 or 5 months that this revolt has gone on for.
1,600, latest numbers at least 1,600.
Yeah.
Do you think it's significant that Saudi Arabia stepped in this week? And do you
Well,
think
I think
it
it's
could have an
significant,
effect?
but I don't know exactly where it leads. I mean, if you are Bashar al-Assad and the people around him, the question is, how can you meet the demands of Saudi Arabia or the United States or the international community and still stay in power, alive, solvent? The answer is you can't meet those demands and stay in power, alive, or solvent if you are the Alawite establishment around Bashar al-Assad. So the question is, what have they got to lose? They can face sanctions. They can survive them. We saw Saddam Hussein survive the most draconian sanctions in history for year after year. And I'm sure that the Syrians think that they can do the same thing, because the alternative for the Assad regime is basically death.
Do you think Assad can survive this?
Yes. I mean, unfortunately, yes. But it's a bit like Macbeth. They're in blood steeped so far that to leave it is as bloody as going forward. I mean, this is their, the deaths pile upon themselves, and he feels he's fighting for his minority. And really, I think it will have a big impact in the long term in terms of Syria's influence in the rest of the region. I think it will hurt their relations with Lebanon. It will undermine, I mean, already Hamas is in a very uncomfortable place. And I think these things matter. But compare it to Libya and Gaddafi. I mean, it's the same problem Gaddafi has. And we're certainly not bombing Syria. I mean,
should we be?
Well, I mean, I'm not saying we should be bombing Libya. I'm just saying that if you look at the contrast, you see the vivid hypocrisy of Western rhetoric, which is pushing Middle Eastern rhetoric. I mean, the fact is either people shoot or they don't shoot. That's what defines the success of a revolution. And the people will either rise up against the army. What they have to do is convince the Alawite minority that it won't be a war to their death if the Assad regime goes.
And the Alawites are never going to believe that.
No.
A pretty bleak outlook, but as long as it seems to be a perfect deadlock because the regime isn't going to stop. But today we saw the biggest protests yet in some places, so it doesn't seem like the protesters are prepared to give in either.
That's really admirable of the Syrian population. I mean, it's a very worrying situation. I was here in the set 3 weeks ago, and we actually had more or less the same discussion, and we haven't made any progress in the last 3 weeks. We just said again, no, what you're doing is not right. And Ashar said, okay, it's, you know.
But presumably for a lot of the Western leaders, I mean, the problem with countries like Libya and Syria is that they are completely repressive totalitarian regimes. There's no bend in the system. There's just break. It's completely brittle. And the great fear is what comes next. It might be a lot worse than Assad. And I think that's the sort of conundrum for a lot of Western leaders.
This is where we've been. I mean, we were both in Tahrir Square during the Egyptian Revolution. One of the great things that happened in Egypt is that it all happened so fast. Yeah. Mubarak went down so quickly. The longer these things play out, the more the power goes into the hands of the real tough guys, the real mean guys, the real ideologues. Ultimately, it's the crazies who will keep fighting until the end. And all the other people sort of fall away. In Egypt, it's not the crazies. In Egypt, you have a lot of rational people with different opinions trying to forge a new system, and it's a wonderful thing to behold, often with a lot of difficult moments. But in Libya, it's going to be more problematic, and in Syria, more problematic still. If this goes on for another year, 2 years, this sort of drags out, who's going to emerge as the only power that can oppose Assad? It's going to be the kind of people that we're most afraid of.
But and the country is right now on lockdown, isn't it? And you've got these wealthy middle class people in Aleppo and Damascus, etc., all watching and saying that we need to get back to business. The economy is taking a hit. Might they be able to put some pressure on Assad eventually?
Well, I think, that's true. And then sanctions, the Americans are pushing people for more sanctions, could possibly help. But in the end, the Syrian people have to do it. No one's going to give it to them. It's not going to be like Libya. And the pity of it is that Bashar came into office at least with the promise of reform. I mean, I don't know how sincere it was, but I think he's now, I don't want to give him too much credit, but I think he's now really been captured by the hardliners in his own family and in his own tribe. And I don't think he's really in charge of things.
Yeah, it's very hard to judge because journalists are not allowed into the country. So what's really going on, we might not know. But it is true that when Assad came to power in 2000, he promised some kind of transparency. He even talked about democracy, but that only lasted 6-7 months, and then it was gone. It was complete lockdown, and journalists were arrested again. And he has been this cruel ever since. And so I'm very pessimistic about Syria and optimistic about the rest of our reports.
But interestingly, Assad's strategy, he's been promising reforms all throughout this. Do you think that's kind of delayed things? It's delayed condemnation from the international community?
I think the easiest way to understand Syria, and in fact most of the Arab regimes before these revolutions, was as mafia states. They're basically run like family enterprises, where they may make some promises here, some promises there. You may have a Michael Corleone instead of a Sonny Corleone, but essentially that's what you're dealing with. And I think if you look at Syria in that light, it suddenly becomes really quite clear what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a mafia called the Assad family, and its relatives who are running the country in their interests, and they give a little here, give a little there. They do what they think they need to do to stay in power, but when it comes right down to it, they'll go down to the mattresses and they'll fight it out to the end, and that's what they're doing.
And what's key, of course, is Assad still has the loyalty of the army. I mean, he got rid of his interior minister earlier this week, didn't he, and replaced him with someone else.
Yeah.
That's key, isn't it, that the army are still following orders?
Well, but they've,
for
they've
sure.
spent generations making sure.
I would think the Egyptian revolution might have turned out very different had the army, backed Mubarak to the end. There was a point at which they said, "We're not your guys anymore," and that point will probably not come in Syria. Am I correct? That
That's the problem, because the army is so blooded too that if it falls apart, I think there's going to be hell to pay for them, which they understand. Of course, my view of Egypt is slightly different, which is that we had an army coup rather than a revolution, and the army stepped in when it knew that Mubarak had completely lost the game to make sure that things didn't go to hell in a handbasket. I think they will give up a fair amount of control, but I'm a little less optimistic about how Egypt will come out, perhaps, than you are.
But I don't think one thing excludes the other.
No.
I mean, you had this chaotic situation created where everybody wanted Mubarak out, and the army came in and they accommodated the public desire, and everything else has been negotiated ever since, which is a level of negotiation in government that hasn't existed anywhere in the Arab world in our lifetime. So.
Do you think Assad's going to be in power 1 year from now?
Yeah, I think
possibly, yeah. Yeah, I think Chris is quite right. It's just like the Gaddafis and just like the Ben Alis were in Tunisia. These guys have everything to lose and nothing to gain by sharing the cake with everybody else in the country.
Okay, all right, we'll leave it there. Vivian Walt, Christopher Dickey, Stefan de Vries and Stephen Erlanger, thank you very much indeed to you all for being with us this evening. Thanks to you for watching. That was The World This Week. I'll be back on Monday with another debate. Stay tuned. This is France 24.